Thank you, Mr Assistant Speaker. Can I now move the amendment number 2 circulated in my name?
The question is the amendment be agreed. Ms Clay.
Thank you. This amendment seeks to end the $41 million public subsidy given by the AST government to the horse racing industry under the 2022 MOU. The AST Greens oppose this MOU and oppose providing any public funds to the horse racing industry. We do not think the horse racing industry is providing a public good. We do not think it should be half funded by the public. In order to allow the industry to organise itself and to ensure the people and animals involved are properly cared for during the transition, we propose that no further MOUs should be made. We further propose that the current funding should be phased out. This is the third time I've put up a budget amendment on this issue. I am running amendments to phase out the funding over the 5 years of the MOU. In 22, I put up an amendment to reduce funding by 20%. In 23, I put up an amendment to reduce funding by 40%. Both times, ACT Labor and the Canberra Liberals voted these down. ACT Labor and the Canberra Liberals voted to keep funding the horse racing industry with public money. This year, I'm putting up an amendment to reduce funding by 60%. Here are my reasons. The horse racing industry has lost its social licence. In 22, when I tabled my first amendment, Right Act probed the polls. They asked, do you think the ACT taxpayer should support the horse racing industry? 1,525 readers voted. 74% of people voted no, the social licence has run out for racing. 3 in 4 Canberrans think the horse racing industry has lost its social licence. Our community does not want to support this industry. They certainly don't want to support it with their money. This special funding deal lacks scrutiny and transparency. Now, since 2013, over $100 million of public funds have been spent or pledged to the horse racing industry under special MOUs. That's over $100 million with almost no public scrutiny. These funding deals did not run through any kind of grant process. They did not run through a procurement. They did not have to go through a commissioning process. There was no competitive process to decide whether this industry provides the best service or whether this was the best use of public money. Up until very recently, there was not even transparency about the deal itself. Previous MOUs were not public. They did not appear on any website, they were not published. There was not usually a line item in the AST budget to say how much public money was being given to the horse racing industry. It was buried in consolidated amounts. The deals were struck outside of any competitive process and with very little public knowledge. Now, the current MOU is a public document. This is a really good thing. I suspect that is one of the reasons that people are now so angry about it. They may have been angry before, but they didn't know. Now they know how their money is being spent. So the funds are at least now transparent, but they are still allocated outside of any public tender or competitive grant process and outside of any commissioning process. These are not even annual decisions, like most budget decisions. We are constantly told that community groups and arts organisations and various sectors can't possibly get long-term funding. We are told that budgets are annual and that funding has to be annual. Any funding decision that isn't annual needs a very special case made out and probably has to run through a commissioning process or a major public procurement. Unless you are the horse racing industry, in which case you can get a 5-year recurrent fund deal locked in with indexation. Now let's talk about that indexation. The horse racing MOU has permanent indexation built in. The indexation is pinned to CPI. It's CPI minus 0.5% and it's automatic. Now personally, I think if an organisation is worth funding long term, they should have that funding indexed. It's only fair, otherwise they go backwards. But the indexation rule is not applied consistently. Across our arts, sports and community sectors, indexation is a really vexed question. Some get it, some don't. Many have to lobby for indexation and only get it after an extensive media campaign. Where they get it at all, it often falls short of increased costs. Many organisations don't know if they're getting indexation or not. It's discretionary, so they can't budget for it. Sometimes it's handed out for part of a year only. And sometimes indexation is even announced as a funding increase. But the horse racing industry get this as a right under their MOU. They don't have to beg. And I don't remember seeing a press release each year boasting about how that funding for the horse racing industry was increased again or how they got a record level of public funds this year. This funding is out of step with the sports sector. Each year the AST government funds the AST Brumbies with 1.8 million. The Canberra Raiders get 2.6 million. Canberra United get a comparably small 250,000 per year, plus they're getting a one-off 200,000 this year after a fierce public campaign to get a financial lifeline with a petition tabled by my colleague Laura Nuttall. Community sport and recreation groups can apply for funding under the Club Enhancement Program. Grant recipients get up to $20,000 each. In 24, the successful recipients got a combined amount between all of them of $226,850. There's also a sports industry partnership program for around 14 major sports associations, and between them, they got 1.3 million. And there's a state organisation support program for sports groups with a total funding pool of around 180,000. If you add up all of those amounts together, if you combine the public funding we give to the Brumbies, the Raiders, Canberra United, and what every single community sport and recreation club and sports industry partnership and state organisation support program gets, if you combine all of those amounts for over 30 sporting, community and professional groups, you will find that the horse racing industry gets more than all of them combined. ACT Labor and the Canberra Liberals have decided that the horse racing industry is worth more public support than the Brumbies, the Raiders, Canberra United, and all of our community and professional sports groups combined. Now, this funding is out of step with the arts sector. Our arts organisations are struggling to survive. Costs are rising, leaving organisations struggling to maintain facilities, roll out programs, and pay proper wages to artists and arts workers. Many of the arts organisations in Canberra recently signed an open letter pointing out their funding shortfalls. Under this budget, all of our arts centres and arts organisations had to share in a funding pool of $8 million. That's what they got between them. That is also less than the horse racing industry got. We could literally double the arts budget if we reallocated those public funds. ACT Labor and the Canberra Liberals have decided that the horse racing industry is worth more public support than the entire arts sector. Now, this funding is out of step with the community sector. I'm sure every MLA in here has heard the same calls I have. Our community sector is struggling as it never has before. The cost of living crisis means more people need their services, and at the same time, the costs to provide those services have gone up. We've heard a lot of calls from the community sector during estimates to increase funds. One in particular asked how the horse racing industry got their funding. He said the increase in funding that his entire organisation was asking for to provide essential safety services to the Canberra community was less than the indexation given to the horse racing industry. Not less than their funds. It was, of course, far less than the funds given to the horse racing industry. It was less than the CPI index on those funds. He was told by a Labor committee member, and I quote, "You're losing me on that one. That is a bit silly, and we do not have a lot of time, so we are not going down that path." Now, I don't think it is a silly question. I think it is a good point, and I think it is entirely appropriate to talk about that during an estimates hearing. How does a community sector organisation get the kind of funding deal that ACT Labor gives to the horse racing industry? Now, let's talk about tax. We often hear from the horse racing sector about the contribution they make to tax. ACT government collects a tax on betting. That tax is not collected from ACT horse racing alone. It comes from golf, rugby, motocross, horse racing in other states, and many other activities all around Australia. I've spoken about this issue in the past, so I'll be brief. The ICRC, the Independent Competition and Regulatory Commission, first looked at this over a decade ago. They said that ACT horse racing contributed a small and diminishing amount to our betting taxes. I checked the Australian gambling statistics a while ago. That indicated around $250,000 is generated in betting operations tax from bets placed by ACT residents on ACT horse racing. I confirmed this with the Treasurer in estimates in 2022. I put to him the figure of $250,000. He said, and I quote, "I imagine it would be something like that. It is a tiny amount of the total point of consumption tax. That is correct." But they don't get a tiny amount of public funding. They've received and been pledged over $100 million in public funds under their MOUs. Now, what about jobs in the horse racing industry? The Canberra Racing Club often talks about the jobs they create. I've been estimating jobs out at Thoroughbred Park at around 20 jobs per year. I base that on reported wages and salaries in annual reports. I'd like to take the opportunity to correct the record. I got the figure wrong. It looks like they create around 2 FTE jobs at Thoroughbred Park, and I would like to ask if I can have my second 10 minutes now, thank you.
Are you seeking leave for extra 10?
No. I'll take my second 10 minutes now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I got that FTE figure from the Canberra Racing Club's Economic Impact Report. They're required to produce that report under the MOU. It's not a public document. It should be a public document. I've obtained a copy under FOI and I've started wading through. The report says they've created jobs with about 3,440 hours of labour each year at Thoroughbred Park. Based on a 38-hour work week, that's less than 2 FTE positions. I am struggling to add these figures up and I have put these numbers to the Canberra Racing Club. I'm yet to hear back from them. But whether it's 2 jobs or 20 jobs out at Thoroughbred Park, there are not many FTEs created at that racecourse. What about jobs more broadly? Well, the horse racing industry does create jobs. Again, I've looked at the figures in their economic impact report. In that report, they seem to be claiming to create more jobs against ABS classification codes than the ABS says exists in total in those classification codes. For instance, for jobs in sports and physical recreation administrative services, it looks like the horse racing industry claims to create every single one of those jobs. It looks like the horse racing industry thinks they are responsible for every job in sports administration. I'm still wading through these numbers. I have put this information to the Canberra Racing Club. I'm really keen to have a chat to make sure that we can all get our facts straight. But indirectly or directly, I do not think that industry can be creating more jobs than actually exist in the ABS categorisations. What about the broader economic impact from the horse racing industry? Now, I spoke to the Treasurer about this in estimates in 2022, and again, I will quote directly from the Treasurer. He said this about the economic contribution from the horse racing industry. There is clearly a degree of economic activity. There will be various expectations around modelling of what that economic contribution is. Invariably, those who seek to boost the industry status will overstate that economic contribution, and those who seek to end the industry will seek to understate it. My view, for what it's worth, is that the industry tends to overstate the economic contribution. Now, the economic impact report produced by the horse racing industry stated a pretty high economic contribution. It claimed that expenditure generated by thoroughbred racing in the ACT was worth around 81 million. That is clearly not direct expenditure from an organisation with less than 14 million in turnover. But it's also not that big when you compare it to other sectors. The ACT's creative industries contribute $2.9 billion to our local economy, so 81 million is not a lot. Even if we take it as reported, noting the Treasurer's word of caution that the horse racing industry tends to overstate their economic contribution, the vast majority of that contribution, 60%, is from gambling and from ads about gambling. There is a lot of conversation about gambling harm and gambling advertising at the moment. That is their major economic contribution according to their own report. I will restate that. The major economic contribution from the ACT racing industry comes from gambling and gambling ads. Do you think most Canberrans support this? Or would they prefer to support economic contributions associated with the arts, with sport, or with the community sector, or even health, or education, or the environment? Setting aside that the primary contribution appears to come from gambling and gambling advertising, their economic impact dollar per dollar is also quite low. For every dollar spent here, they contribute less than $1 to our local economy. More of the money leaves the ACT than is spent here. Now, why is the ACT government propping up a dying industry? There are a lot of reasons I don't think the ACT government should be funding horse racing. One of them is because I don't think it's the role of government to prop up an industry that's on the way out, particularly an industry that has lost its social licence. Now, I've gone through the annual reports for Thoroughbred Park for the last 4 years, from 2019-2020 up until 22-23, and these are public documents. They paint a pretty dire picture of where the industry is at. The Canberra Racing Club is delivering some worrying financial results. In the last 4 years, ACT government has half funded the racetrack. During those last 4 years, and despite our generous funding, they went from a small surplus to a deficit. The 21-22 deficit was $327,000. Last year's deficit was $1.12 million. Their cash reserves are dropping. The reserves are half that of what they were 4 years earlier. Their total expenses are rising. Their total liabilities are rising. Their liabilities have more than doubled in the last 4 years. Attendance is dropping. The Spring Canberra Racing Carnival used to be a 2-day event. They've collapsed it into a 1-day event. 4 years ago, it got around 10,000 people, and last year it had around 7,000. Those numbers are a fraction of attendance that we see from other Canberra events. Floriade gets over 430,000. The Folk Festival gets 30,000 in a bad year and 50,000 in a good one. Summonats gets over 120,000. So attendance of 7,000 or even 10,000 at the Canberra Racing Carnival is quite small. Some traditional racing events have been cancelled altogether. In 22-23, the TAB Canberra Cup did not meet financial expectations and won't be run again, according to their annual report. Their membership is dropping. 4 years ago, they had over 1,150 members. Last year, this had dropped to 1,002. Most of their numbers are dropping, but one number in particular has increased. Their payments to key management personnel has increased from 200,000 in 1920 to 976,000 in 22-23. That's a pretty sharp increase. It is also a really big slice from a $14 million budget. I'm not going to go into the reasons behind it. I've asked what they are, and I'll leave it up to the Canberra Racing Club to provide more information if they'd like to. But it is another sign of an organisation that's in trouble. Does this sound like an industry with a bright future that the government should be supporting? Or does it sound like an industry that is on the way out that the government should help to transition to make sure that we look after the workers and the animals involved? If the tobacco industry came to us and said they weren't viable unless we covered half their operating costs, and by the way, most of their financial figures were moving in the wrong direction, would we give them more and more funding in order to save jobs? Or would we use our public funding to support jobs in areas that provide public benefit? Now, what is this MOU money being used for? I, of course, can't say dollar for dollar where MOU funding goes. But here's what I can say. The 22-23 MOU provided $6.8 million of public funds to the Canberra Racing Club. That year, the Canberra Racing Club gave out $5.96 million in prize money and $976,000 in payments to key management personnel. It looks an awful lot like the public are funding horse racing prize money and CEO salaries. Now, public funds should be used for public purposes. They should be used to benefit the community. They should not be used to benefit any one particular industry, particularly one that is not providing a community benefit, and particularly one that has lost its social licence. I do not think this MOU funding meets the standards of our Canberra community, and I commend the amendment to the Assembly.
The question is that Ms Clay's amendment number 2 be agreed. Mr Parton.
Thank you, Mr Kane. We won't be supporting this amendment. Never mind social licence. The Greens have kind of lost their adult licence. You've descended into childish, attention-seeking stunts, and honestly, this is juvenile. It's getting silly now. And I think what we're seeing play out here is the reason why the Greens are not anywhere near the steering wheel of any other jurisdiction. You know, you talk about race clubs overstating economic benefit. And I can't remove myself from the fact that the Greens are continually overstating their collective IQ. Ms Clay talks about the financial figures heading in the wrong direction, and I think she'd be right. I think she'd be right because, I mean, she talked about the funding for race clubs here being out of step, and indeed the funding for race clubs here are out of step with every other jurisdiction in Australia. We won't be supporting this amendment, and I'm sort of sick of having this argument. Horse racing is a part of the fabric of Australia. Horse racing, harness racing, and greyhound racing. None of these are the sport of kings, as often claimed by Ms Clay and others. These are the sports of battlers. Their ranks are full of minimum wage battlers, many of whom do not hold the skills to gain employment in other areas. Now, we understand that the Greens hate Australia. We get that. We get it. But we kind of like it. And we won't be seeking to make a change in this space. The allocation of funding from government, which is much lower than the allocation to every other comparable race club in New South Wales, and is indeed much lower than any other jurisdiction in the country, provides direct and indirect employment to 500 people. Now, in the past, Ms Clay and her band of progressive warriors have failed to understand that most of the funding to the race club is returned to the community through prize money. They seem to believe that when it comes to assessing how many jobs are created, we just need to consider the people directly employed by the racing club and the harness racing club. I mean, Ms Clay talked about the attendance figures, and I can tell you that the total attendance for events conducted by the Canberra Race Club for the year is tracking towards 100,000. It's tracking towards 100,000. So it's far in excess of, for argument's sake, the National Folk Festival. The other aspect of this funding that Ms Clay and her activist mob failed to comprehend is that in their belief, and you know, I know we've been through this before, I know. In their belief, only turnover on ACT racing should be taken into account when it comes to the return to government. And it's just ludicrous. It's just ludicrous. When we consider the money that is returned to the ACT government coffers through the point of consumption gaming tax, or the betting operations tax, as we call it, you cannot just consider the ACT events. You must consider all racing, harness racing and greyhound turnover. Canberrans bet a hell of a lot on horse racing in Melbourne and Sydney. Now, Madam Speaker, we do not gather a portion of those taxes and return them to Victoria and New South Wales. We don't do that. We don't gather, oh, this was on the Melbourne Cup, yeah, so we better send it back to Victoria. We don't do that. Any more than Victoria and New South Wales, they don't return the portion of POC that they get from our events. They just don't. It's ridiculous. You have to consider the turnover on the racing codes as a whole. The betting operations tax returns tens of millions of dollars to the ACT coffers, and most of that money comes from betting on racing codes, irrespective of whether the events are held here or elsewhere. Do we write to the Queensland government and ask them for our cut of their turnover on Canberra races? No, we don't do that. That's just ridiculous. I would point out that the remaining ACT racing codes, the ones that you haven't banned yet, receive the lowest per capita funding of any jurisdiction in this country, despite the ACT government being the highest recipient of wagering revenue per capita in the country. The Thoroughbred Park product is beamed around the world to 68 countries, and then when the race club goes down the path, as it is now, of establishing a potential long-term revenue stream, what do the Greens do? They say, oh no, you can't do that either. You can't do that either. We will not be supporting this amendment. I kind of wish you guys would find another hobby. Your obsession with horse racing is getting a little weird.
Question is that Ms Clay's amendment number 2 be agreed. Mr Steele.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and we won't be supporting the amendment either. And I will speak to the JACS appropriation bill more broadly as Special Minister of State in my remarks. In June 2022, the government entered into a Memorandum of Understanding with the Canberra Racing Club and the Canberra Harness Racing Club. And this covered a 5-year period from July 2022 through to June 2027, establishing a performance framework for the ongoing viability, integrity, governance, accountability and efficiency of the industry, including animal welfare obligations. It covers a range of issues, including the basis and timing of government funding for the racing clubs, parties' administrative responsibilities and performance reporting obligations. The MOU requires the clubs to participate in the Joint Racing Industry Government Committee, the JRIGC, as a forum to consult with government on industry topics and report on the performance framework. And funding under the MOU is calculated based on the budget funding proposed in the Independent Competition Regulatory Commission investigation into the ACT racing industry final report from 2011. However, indexation is, as Ms Clay mentioned, set at CPI minus 0.5%. Under the terms of the MOU, the Canberra Racing Club receives 85.72% of the annual funding and Canberra Harness Racing Club receives 14.28%. The ACT Government continues to work with the Canberra Racing Club and the Harness Racing Club on fulfilling their objectives as outlined in the MOU between the clubs and the government. We've made substantial progress on the delivery of key performance indicators under the MOU, and this work has been facilitated by the JRIGC. This includes the development of independent economic reporting and analysis of the club's contributions to the Canberra community. And I want to acknowledge the Canberra Racing Club's efforts to continue to diversify their revenue streams and support for local businesses in their supply chains, as well as their new event offerings, such as the Festival of Speed. With the clubs continuing to meet their KPIs as identified under the MOU, we've been continuing to deliver budget-funded investment as agreed. Another important aspect of the ACT Government's work with the Canberra Racing Club has been the establishment of the Thoroughbred Park Housing and Revitalisation Committee. The role of this committee is to provide advice to government about the redevelopment of the Canberra Racing Club and deliver an integrated project that supports additional housing and commercial activities at Thoroughbred Park. The committee is also preparing advice for government on options for the development, including the optimal delivery model and potential declaration of an urban renewal site. Madam Speaker, we believe in a sustainable future for the Canberra horse racing industry. We've outlined and continue to advocate for the diversification of their business, and the racing clubs have continued to take this on board. I think everyone in the Assembly's position is well known. However, we should continue to work in a positive way to facilitate the development outcomes that will strengthen this approach. The Greens' proposal for redevelopment would see the end of the horse racing industry in Canberra. It discounts the local jobs and businesses that are supported by the horse racing industry here in the ACT. As a general principle, it's best to find ways to deliver an outcome that benefits everyone involved. I think we can have a solution that supports Thoroughbred Park as a nation-leading equine and commercial precinct while delivering thousands of new homes at the same time. We're also looking at this redevelopment as an opportunity to further the master planning work at EPIC, which primarily involves co-locating the Harness Racing Club onto the same site at Thoroughbred Park. It's disappointing that the Greens continue to pull this stunt through this amendment every year. Only this time we know that they're seeking to amend the JACS appropriation to reduce investment provided to the clubs by 60%. This continued waste of the Assembly's time, knowing full well that they do not have the support of the Assembly to pursue this course of action, should simply be called out for what it is. The Greens want to ban horse racing. It's a disingenuous way to have a conversation about the club's revenue base, and it doesn't support the government's and the club's own ambitions to diversify their income streams. Continuing to hide behind the facade of appropriation reduction and suggestions of forcible acquisition of their site through just terms is a pretty gross abuse of government power and decision making. To suggest that the government use those powers to acquire an asset from one property developer to sell it to another property developer because you don't want the former to succeed will not be looked on favourably by the Canberra community. There is a way to deliver an outcome that benefits all parties involved in this process, and that is the path that the ACT Government will continue to pursue. I don't support Ms Clay's amendments and commend the original JACS appropriation to the Assembly.
Question is that Ms Clay's amendment number 2 be agreed. Ms Davidson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I speak today as Minister for Corrections and Justice Health both to this clause and to Ms Clay's amendment. This budget continues to invest in programs that will support the needs of people in the justice system and make our community safer for everyone. Housing is a key consideration when decisions are being made about bail, community corrections orders in sentencing and parole. Having stable housing can support a person to be able to comply with their orders and reduce the risk of further harmful behaviour. When a person does not have access to stable housing that's appropriate to their needs, they're more likely to end up incarcerated or to have a longer period of incarceration. And at an average cost of $543.19 per detainee per day in the ACT in 2022 to 2023, incarceration is without a doubt the most expensive way to solve a homelessness problem. The Justice Housing Program, which was evaluated by ANU in 2023, was found to be successful in reducing recidivism. This is why there is $5.154 million in this budget to continue and expand the Justice Housing Program. The funding includes $3.881 million over 2 years for community housing providers to manage the properties and community support organisations to provide trauma-informed, gender-responsive and culturally appropriate support services during occupancy and follow-up support after exiting the program. $322,000 over 2 years for infrastructure costs, including maintenance, insurance and other government charges for the existing 12 properties, and $951,000 for ACT Corrective Services staff to manage the program. In addition to this, the budget provides funding of $9.49 million for continuation of the following programs to reduce overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our prisons. $3.41 million for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations delivering empowerment yarning circles, Yarrabee Bamia Family Centric Program, Nurrumbide Bail Support and the On Country Program. $598,000 for ACT Corrective Services alternative reporting sites. $2.279 million for the expansion of the circle sentencing courts, including payments to panel members, and $3.203 million for continued funding of the First Nations Justice Branch within Justice and Community Safety Directorate, which goes to Priority Reform Area 3 in the Closing the Gap National Agreement, Transforming Government Organisations. Finally, this budget also provides $616,000 for disability liaison officers within Domestic Violence Crisis Service, Aboriginal Legal Services and Victim Support ACT. Disability liaison officers within these community sector organisations are an important commitment within the Disability Justice Strategy to inclusion and equitable justice for people with disability. Within the network of DLOs that make up the disability justice community of practice, these are the only positions that specifically work with people with disability who've been victims of crime or victim survivors of domestic or family violence and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Madam Speaker, I'm very pleased to be able to speak to this clause of the appropriation bill in this year's budget. I did speak to this clause in last year's debate, which I'm sure you'll recall as cheerfully as I do. But unfortunately, I wasn't a minister with administrative arrangements for corrections at the time, and so I didn't have the opportunity to say all the things that I wanted to say about justice reinvestment and the radical love philosophy that is truly at the heart of justice reinvestment. But here we are again, and this time I am blessed with the opportunity to talk about this important issue that affects all of us in the community. Because if we're serious about being a human rights jurisdiction, if we're serious about reducing recidivism, if we're serious about reducing the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in prisons, and if we're serious about improving community safety, then we must prioritise justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment is not just about those elements of the budget that are funded from the justice and community safety portfolio. It's about taking a trauma-informed, gender-responsive, culturally appropriate approach to the underlying causes of behaviour that is harmful to the person and to others in our community. The only way to be tough on crime is to be courageous about ending poverty. Madam Speaker, in both the last term of this Assembly and in this term of the Assembly, we have seen significantly increased investment in mental health services, drug and alcohol services with a harm reduction approach that treats drug use as a health issue, homelessness services, family support to reduce the impacts of domestic and family violence, functional family therapy programs to reduce harmful behaviour in young people at risk of ending up in the justice system, and disability support services. As a result, we've seen a reduction in the number of offences reported to police each year from 2018 onwards. There's more to do, but today's Phase 2 Justice Reinvestment Strategy launch tells us that we're headed in the right direction. Now, I checked the police data last night and I'm hoping that someone can take some notes for Mr Parton because I've got some data incoming now. In 2017, there were 48,579 offences reported to police and infringements issued. In 2018, there were 44,200. In 2019, it was 43,171. In 2020, there were 41,285. In 2021, there were 36,111. In 2022, there were 33,449. In 2023, there were 33,804 offences reported and infringements issued, which was 14,775 fewer than in 2017. Already in the first half of 2024, we have seen 3,161 fewer offences reported than for the same period last year. Now, comparing 2023 with 2017, we've seen reductions in reported offences of stolen motor vehicles, burglary, property damage, theft other than stolen motor vehicles and other offences. We've also seen fewer traffic and criminal infringements issued. Now, there is still more work to do, as we've seen increases in offences of assault, sexual assault and robbery between 2017 and 2023, and that's why we need to continue to understand what works and do more of it. And so I commend our Attorney-General, Minister Rattenberry, for his ongoing commitment and today's launch of Phase 2 of the Justice Reinvestment Strategy for the ACT. Madam Speaker, justice reinvestment works. It works to make our community safer and it works to improve people's life outcomes. So if we're going to talk about justice and community safety, and if we're going to talk about justice reinvestment as the approach we're taking, then we also need to acknowledge the important investments in this year's budget in mental health, drug harm reduction, homelessness services, and supporting victim survivors of domestic and family violence. These investments include, for example, the youth foyer at the new CIT Woden campus, training for ACT policing and courts to build knowledge and understanding of coercive control, and strengthening access to restorative justice programs. It includes $15 million over 4 years in mental health programs, including for some of our most at-risk children under 12 years old, for people with mental health conditions at risk of homelessness, and for people with mental health conditions exiting a period of detention so that they can transition safely back into the community. There's funding to develop Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and trauma services for young people and to help build culturally responsive capacity across our mental health sector. And there's funding for continued drug harm reduction services. Kamala Harris says that public safety depends on public trust. It depends on people believing that they will be treated fairly and transparently. It is not fair to incarcerate a person because we don't have the right integrated mental health and drug and alcohol services, or because our justice system is not accessible or inclusive of the needs of people with disability, or because there isn't enough housing and our prison has become the homelessness service of last resort. The fair thing to do is to invest in services in the community so that fewer people engage in behaviour that brings them into contact with the justice system, and so that for people who do have a period of incarceration, it is brief and not repeated. And this is why a responsible government invests in preventing harmful behaviour, not just on dealing with offending that has already happened. And that's why our investments in health and social services in this budget are also important right now. Now, those opposite will tell you that the only way to improve community safety is to lock up more people, and that's a way of thinking that belongs in the past. Because when the cause of behaviour that creates a community safety risk is unmet needs for housing, health and social services, then the only way to improve community safety is to ensure that we improve access to those basic things that people need to live a healthy, meaningful, pro-social life. Now, I know that this is difficult to accept when those unmet needs result in some very challenging behaviour. But if we can keep in mind Dr. Cornel West's advice to pursue justice with love in your heart, then we stand a much better chance at creating a community that is safer for all of us. Madam Speaker, I'd like to make some comments about the amendments that were moved by Ms Clay. Now, I've heard a number of community sector organisations delivering important work in health and social services and support for parents and grandparents express deep frustration that they have to beg for funding increases to address the increased volume and complexity of work that they're expected to do for our growing population. And yet the horse racing industry just keeps getting handed subsidies through the ACT budget. Now, what does the horse racing deliver for our community? It delivers more gambling. Ms Clay has talked about how little revenue that generates for ACT taxpayers. Well, let me tell you what it costs us. Addictive gambling, including horse racing, costs our community in the consequences for people's physical and mental health and well-being, domestic and family violence and criminal offences. That's why Ms Clay's amendments to remove ACT government funding for the horse racing industry are important. The other two parties in this place tell us that they prioritise health and well-being and they want to reduce domestic and family violence in our community. They tell us that they're very worried about crime rates. Well, it's time to put their money where their mouth is and make the right choice for Canberrans. End government funding for destructive and harmful addictive gambling and instead invest that money in things that will actually improve health and well-being in our community. The days of the old parties in this place just doing the same thing every year, continuing to fund these things that people in our community don't want to see getting their taxpayer funds, while we still have wait lists for health and social services and thinking that nobody is going to notice or do anything about it. need to end. And if other members in this room are unhappy that I'm criticising the policy positions of the two old parties that continue to support this horse racing industry subsidy, I suggest that they get a better policy, because none will be free until the old ways are over.
Question is Ms Clay's amendment be agreed. Those with that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The noes have it. Ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells. No pairs. Thank you.